For 30 years, America ended its day with a laugh, and with one man, Johnny Carson. The smooth voice, the easy charm, the knowing grin that could disarm presidents and movie stars alike. On screen, he was the perfect host, part jester, part confidant, part American ritual. But behind that silver desk and effortless smile, there was another Carson, a man both adored and feared. Brilliant, yes, but unyielding, polite yet capable of quiet vengeance. To millions, he was the king of late night. To those who crossed him, he was something else entirely. Carson ruled television from 1962 to 1992, an empire of laughter built on precision, control, and trust. In his world, timing was sacred, reputation was everything, and loyalty was law. The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was the gateway to American fame. One appearance could make a career. One mistake could end it. Over the decades, 8 names would quietly vanish from Carson's guest list, not because they faded from fame, but because they angered the one man no one dared offend. Some were defiant, some were reckless, and some simply misjudged the quiet power of the man behind the curtain. Each band carried its own story, a flash of defiance, a spark of betrayal, or a moment so humiliating it burned into late-night legend. These were the nights when laughter stopped and the smiles turned to silence. Tonight we reveal the untold stories of 8 guests Johnny Carson hated so much they were banned for life. In the mid-1970s, Shelley Winters was more than a movie star. She was a force, outspoken, sharp-tongued, a woman unafraid to spar with anyone, even the men who ruled the screen. Her energy lit up every stage she walked onto, but on one unforgettable night, that spark turned to fire. The evening began with light banter, playful jabs, knowing smiles. Carson, ever the ringmaster, teased her with a remark about her love life, a typical quip, harmless by late-night standards. But this time, it landed wrong. Winters' eyes narrowed, a pause filled the studio. Then, without warning, she reached for her glass, a full drink, right in Johnny Carson's face. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Carson sat still, drenched, his grin locked in place, a professional mask barely holding. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. Shelley leaned back, unrepentant, her defiance echoing through the studio lights. Carson wiped his face, smiled faintly, and finished the segment. But inside, the verdict was already written. The next morning, Shelley Winters' name was quietly added to an internal list, permanent ban. She would never again walk through those famous curtains. For Winters, the consequences were immediate. Late-night television, her link to millions of households, closed its doors. Producers hesitated to book her. Her defiance, however justified, had become a warning to others. No one embarrasses Johnny Carson and survives unscathed. In private, Carson didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. His silence was the sentence. But if Shelley Winters' defiance was born from temper, the next clash came from conviction. A pair of comedians who dared turn laughter into protest and paid the price. In the 1960s, the Smothers Brothers were comedy's conscience, equal parts jesters and rebels. Their humor carried teeth, anti-war, anti-establishment, and unflinchingly sharp. To their fans, they were truth-tellers wrapped in melody, but to television's gatekeepers, their politics made them dangerous. When Tom and Dick Smothers appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson expected charm and song, not controversy. Carson had one golden rule: no politics on his stage. The Tonight Show was a sanctuary from the turmoil outside, a world of jokes, jazz, and easy laughter. For Johnny, that separation wasn't just preference, it was protection. Midway through their segment, the brothers dropped the punchlines and began speaking about Vietnam, about young men dying, about censorship, about truth. The audience fell silent, unsure whether to clap or recoil. Carson's smile didn't fade, but his eyes said everything. When the camera stopped, so did the laughter. Carson, furious, confronted them backstage. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply said, "You broke the rule." After that night, the Smothers Brothers weren't banned outright, but their invitations slowed to a trickle. When they did return, their appearances were shorter, their topics tightly controlled. What had once been effortless banter now came with invisible chains. The soft ban, as staffers later called it, marked a turning point. Carson's show would never again flirt with politics so openly. For the Smothers Brothers, it was another battle lost in their long war against network censorship. They had challenged the king of late night and learned that even rebellion had its limits under his reign. But the next betrayal would cut deeper. It wouldn't come from firebrand comedians or political radicals. It would come from someone Johnny trusted, someone he called a friend. In the golden glow of The Tonight Show, Joan Rivers was the rising star, quick, fearless, and dazzlingly funny. She was everything Carson admired and everything television needed. He championed her before America, telling audiences she's going to be a big star. For years, she was his most frequent guest host, the one person trusted to hold the kingdom's throne in his absence. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was personal. Carson mentored her, defended her, and opened every door. To many, she was the heir apparent. But in 1986, that bond shattered overnight. When Fox offered Joan her own late-night show, she accepted, thrilled, nervous, and eager to prove herself. But she made one mistake. She didn't tell Johnny first. Carson found out from the trades. The news broke like a betrayal whispered through Hollywood corridors. That evening, Carson's number flashed on her phone. When Joan answered, he didn't yell. He simply hung up. She would never hear from him again. Within days, her name was struck from the guest list. Her Fox show struggled. The network turned cold. When it was canceled, she found herself professionally exiled, banned from the very stage that made her a household name. Years later, Rivers would speak of it through tears. I loved him, but he never forgave me. For Carson, it wasn't business, it was personal. To him, loyalty was sacred, and her silence before the announcement was the ultimate betrayal. Joan Rivers would rebuild her empire, but her mentor's forgiveness never came. If betrayal broke Johnny's trust, the next guest shattered his patience. A literary genius turned tragic spectacle, whose drunken defiance ended not with laughter, but with shame. Truman Capote was brilliance wrapped in scandal. The celebrated author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, he had long been a darling of Hollywood's elite, witty, unpredictable, and dangerously charming. But by the late 1970s, the sharp edges of genius had dulled. Excess, loneliness, and addiction shadowed every appearance. When he walked onto The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson expected eccentricity, not chaos. From his first words, something was off. Capote slurred, meandered through half-remembered stories, and laughed at moments no one understood. The audience tittered nervously. Carson tried to steer the conversation back, offering gentle lifelines, but Capote drifted further into incoherence. Then, the moment broke. Capote made a crude remark about a Hollywood figure, one too powerful, too taboo to mock on live television. Gasps rippled through the studio. Carson's face stiffened. Without a word, Johnny signaled for commercial. The band played. The cameras cut, and the audience sat in uneasy silence. When the show returned, Capote was gone. His chair sat empty, the laughter forced. Afterward, Carson reportedly told his producers, "Never again." There was no public announcement, no press release, only absence. Truman Capote would never appear on The Tonight Show again. For Carson, the ban wasn't about ego, it was about control. His show was a temple of polish and precision, and Capote's collapse had violated that sanctity. For Capote, it was another door closing in a life defined by brilliance and self-destruction. The laughter that once greeted Truman Capote had turned into whispers. Behind the curtain, Carson had drawn another invisible line, one no one dared cross again. But the next feud would not be about humiliation on stage. It would be about insult, personal, cutting, and dangerous enough to turn words into threats. To America, Wayne Newton was Mr. Las Vegas, a symbol of charm, polish, and relentless optimism. But behind the sequins and spotlights, Newton carried a quiet fury, and one night that fury collided with the most powerful man in late-night television. For years, Johnny Carson had playfully teased Newton during monologues, jokes about his hair, his mannerisms, his boyish looks. But as time went on, those jokes sharpened, turning toward whispered rumors about Newton's sexuality. Each punchline drew laughs, but beneath them was humiliation. Newton tried to ignore it. He smiled through interviews, brushed off reporters, yet the jokes continued, and in an era when such insinuations could cripple a career, they struck deep. Eventually, Newton decided to confront the source. Accounts differ on what happened next, but most agree. Wayne Newton found Johnny Carson face-to-face, off-camera. The charm was gone. Newton, furious, warned Carson to stop, or he would make him stop. It wasn't a threat for show. It was raw, personal anger. Carson, shaken, told his producers that Newton would never set foot on this stage again. The ban was swift, silent, and final. For Newton, the fallout was severe. Though he thrived in Las Vegas, his television presence all but vanished. The Tonight Show, his bridge to middle America, was gone forever. For Carson, it was a reminder that words, once laughter, could become weapons. The two men never reconciled. Each built his empire in separate worlds. Carson in quiet dominance, Newton under neon lights. In that silence lay a truth. Even laughter has limits, and every king eventually meets someone who refuses to kneel. But not every battle was fought with anger. The next would be waged with irony, a comedian whose weapon wasn't rage, but mockery itself. Charles Grodin wasn't like other guests. Where most sought Carson's approval, Grodin sought discomfort. His humor was dry to the point of drought. Every pause deliberate, every glance laced with parody. It was a kind of comedy that toyed with tension, and Johnny Carson was its perfect target. At first, Carson admired it. The sparring had energy, Grodin's mock irritation, Johnny's bemused patience. It made for unpredictable television. But over time, the line between act and insult began to blur. During one now infamous segment, Grodin accused Carson of pretending to like his guests. The audience laughed nervously. Johnny laughed too, but his eyes hardened. Grodin pressed further, mocking the rituals of The Tonight Show itself. The compliments, the fake applause, the carefully timed charm. The joke had crossed from playful to personal. When the camera stopped, Carson's reaction was calm, almost too calm. There was no confrontation, no shouting, but Grodin's name quietly disappeared from the booking list. The unspoken rule had been broken. You could laugh with Johnny Carson, but never at him. Publicly, Grodin played coy, insisting it was all performance art, that he and Johnny were partners in the discomfort. But privately, Carson didn't find it amusing. His show was built on control, and Grodin had turned that control into the punchline. For Carson, it wasn't hatred, it was rejection. The trust between host and guest, sacred and unseen, had been mocked before millions. After Grodin's quiet exile, The Tonight Show tightened its edges. Risk was replaced with routine. The laughter grew safer, but the next band would strike closer to imitation than insult. A performer whose talent mirrored Carson too closely, until the imitation became unbearable. For years, Rich Little was a fixture of The Tonight Show, the master impressionist, the man of 1,000 voices, and one of Johnny Carson's favorites. His mimicry of Hollywood icons turned him into a household name, but his most famous impression was also the most dangerous, Johnny himself. At first, Carson loved it. He laughed, played along, even encouraged the routine. Little's take on Johnny's smooth cadence and sly expressions became a recurring delight, but repetition dulls novelty, and soon the laughter began to sound different, sharper, closer to mockery than tribute. Over time, the act grew stale. Producers began to whisper that Rich was recycling old material, relying on familiar jokes. Off camera, he was said to be difficult, late to rehearsals, dismissive of staff. For Carson, whose empire ran on professionalism, such behavior wasn't forgivable. The final break came quietly. No confrontation, no scandal. One day, Rich Little's invitation simply never arrived. He was replaced by new faces, younger comedians, safer choices. When reporters asked why he'd stopped appearing, Little shrugged. I guess Johnny got tired of me. Behind the scenes, the truth was simpler. Carson didn't dislike Rich, he was just done with him. In Johnny's world, silence was more final than anger. In later years, Little would speak fondly of Johnny, never bitter, always respectful. But the message had been clear. The king did not share his crown, even in imitation. The laughter that once filled The Tonight Show had boundaries, invisible, unspoken, but absolute. And yet, there was one final guest who would cross them all, a man who embodied the chaos Carson despised, loud, unrestrained, and unwilling to play by anyone's rules. In the 1980s, Morton Downey Jr. was television's storm. Loud, brash, unapologetically confrontational. He called it truth talk. Others called it spectacle. His rise marked a new kind of broadcasting, unfiltered, emotional, built on confrontation rather than conversation. To Johnny Carson, it represented everything he feared television was becoming. When Downey appeared on The Tonight Show, it was meant to be a meeting of opposites, civility versus fury. But from the first moments, it spiraled. Downey interrupted, argued, taunted the band, and mocked Carson's reserved demeanor. What he saw as energy, Johnny saw as disrespect. The air thickened, laughter faltered. At one point, Carson leaned back, silent. The audience sensed it, the shift from amusement to disdain. For Johnny, control was everything, and Downey's aggression shredded that delicate balance. When the cameras cut to commercial, Carson stood and walked off set. He didn't return until Downey was gone. The episode never aired in full. After that night, Carson issued a quiet decree. Morton Downey Jr. was banned permanently, not for one outburst, but for what he symbolized. To Johnny, Downey wasn't a guest. He was a warning, proof that television's future might no longer belong to grace, timing, or civility. By the early 90s, Downey's star had fallen. His voice, once thunderous, faded into whispers of tabloid memory. Carson, still reigning behind the desk, had kept his world untouched by that chaos. In his silence, Carson drew the final boundary, the edge between entertainment and anarchy. Downey had crossed it, and in doing so became the last name ever truly banned from The Tonight Show. But Carson's bans weren't just punishments. They were reflections of a man guarding something sacred, the dignity of laughter itself. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson's laughter defined American nights. Yet behind the applause and monologues lay an unspoken truth. Power never announces itself. It simply chooses who may speak and who must vanish. Each band told a story, not of cruelty, but of control. Shelley Winters defied him with fire. The Smothers Brothers tested his rule of silence. Joan Rivers betrayed his trust. Truman Capote exposed the chaos he feared. Wayne Newton challenged his dignity. Charles Grodin mocked his mask. Rich Little reflected him too closely, and Morton Downey Jr. embodied everything he refused to become. Together they form a mosaic of the man himself, charming, brilliant, wounded, and unyielding. Carson's bands weren't born from hatred. They were acts of of preservation. Every confrontation reminded him that television's power was fragile, that one unscripted moment could break the illusion he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. To viewers at home, Johnny Carson was laughter without consequence, a nightly ritual of calm in a turbulent world. But to those who knew him, that calm came at a price. He ruled his domain with invisible strings, ensuring that The Tonight Show remained untouched by chaos, controversy, or betrayal. In 1992, when Carson said his final goodnight, the world felt a silence it hadn't known in 30 years. He left behind not just memories of laughter, but a blueprint, one that showed the cost of maintaining perfection. In the end, perhaps his bans weren't punishments at all, but boundaries drawn by a man who understood that every empire of laughter must defend itself from its own undoing, because behind every perfect smile lies a story untold, and behind every legend, a shadow that never quite leaves the stage. If you thought Johnny Carson's grudges were explosive, wait until you see what went on behind Hollywood's golden curtain. In our previous expose, the glamour gave way to scandal, and the legends revealed their rawest sides. So don't stop here. Binge the chaos, the charm, and the secrets that built an era of starlight and silence. You're watching Vintage Spotlight, where legends shine and shadows speak.